The flashing red and blue lights reflected off the water like broken promises as Margaret Chen watched 3 patrol cars surround her modest boathouse. She clutched the weathered deed in her trembling hands, the same deed that would soon turn her HOA's world upside down. They thought they were calling the cops on a rule-breaking neighbor. They had no idea they were about to face the rightful owner of every inch of waterfront property their million-dollar mansions sat on. Sometimes the smallest fish carries the morning sun, cast long shadows across Willowbrook Estates as Margaret Chen carefully lowered her small fishing boat into the water behind her modest ranch house. At 62, she moved with the deliberate precision of someone who had learned that every action mattered, every detail counted. The boathouse she'd built with her late husband's hands 30 years ago creaked gently in the morning breeze, its weathered wood a stark contrast to the gleaming architectural marvels that had sprouted around the lake in recent years. Excuse me. The shrill voice cut through the peaceful morning like a rusty blade. Margaret looked up to see Vivian Blackwood striding across the manicured lawn that separated their properties, her perfectly coiffed blonde hair catching the light, her designer athleisure outfit pristine despite the early hour. Behind her, like a pack of well-dressed wolves, came 3 other members of the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association board. Margaret straightened, her weathered hands still gripping the boat's rope. "Good morning, Vivian. Don't you good?" "Morning me," Vivian snapped, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "That eyesore of a structure," she gestured dismissively at the boathouse, "is in direct violation of the community aesthetic standards. The board has been more than patient with you, Margaret, but this ends today." Behind Vivian, Todd Brennan adjusted his expensive sunglasses and crossed his arms. As the HOA's legal counsel and a partner at the city's most prestigious law firm, he radiated the confidence of a man who had never lost a property dispute. "Mrs. Chen, you were given 30 days to comply with the removal order. That deadline passed last week." Margaret's grip tightened on the rope. "This boathouse has been here since before your development existed. My husband and I built it in 1993. "That's irrelevant," interjected Sandra Fleming, the HOA treasurer, her voice clipped and businesslike. "When you joined the association, you signed the covenant agreeing to all current and future regulations. The boathouse violates aesthetic guidelines established in 2018. "I never signed any covenant," Margaret said quietly, but her words seemed to bounce off the wall of designer confidence facing her. Vivian laughed, a sharp sound like breaking crystal. "Oh, Margaret, you sweet, confused thing. Every property owner in Willowbrook Estates is automatically bound by the HOA agreement. It's in your deed restrictions." "You clearly don't understand property law," Todd added, his tone patronizing. "The covenant runs with the land. It doesn't matter when you moved here or what you think you agreed to." Margaret felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the same feeling she'd experienced countless times over the past 5 years as the neighborhood transformed around her. When she and Robert had bought their little piece of paradise, it had been surrounded by farmland and forests. Now McMansions worth millions crowded the shoreline, their owners viewing her humble home as a blight on their investment. "Mrs. Chen," said the 4th board member, Dr. Harrison Welsh, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone accustomed to delivering bad news, "we're prepared to be reasonable. The association has a fund for property improvements. We could help you build something more ... appropriate. More appropriate." Margaret's voice carried an edge that made Vivian's perfectly plucked eyebrows arch in surprise. "Something that fits the neighborhood standards," Vivian clarified. "Modern materials, architectural coherence with the existing structures." "Really, Margaret? You should be thanking us. We're offering to help you increase your property value." Margaret looked at the boathouse, remembering Robert's careful measurements, his patient explanations of joinery and weatherproofing, the way his eyes had lit up when they'd finally launched their first boat from the little dock he'd built by hand. The structure wasn't just wood and nails, it was memory made manifest, love given form. "No," she said simply. The word hung in the morning air like a challenge. Vivian's face flushed red beneath her expertly applied makeup. "I beg your pardon," I said. "No. I'm not tearing down my boathouse." Todd stepped forward, his legal training evident in the way he positioned himself close enough to intimidate, far enough to maintain plausible deniability. Mrs. Chen, I don't think you understand the gravity of this situation. The HOA has the legal authority to enforce compliance. We can place a lien on your property. We can fine you daily until you comply. We can even force the sale of your home. If necessary, you can try, Margaret said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Vivian's laugh was sharper now, edged with cruelty. Oh, you poor, deluded woman. Do you think you can fight us? Do you see these houses around you? Each one is worth more than you'll make in a lifetime. The board represents $50 million in property value. You're one little old lady with a falling-down shack, and you're trespassing on my property, Margaret replied, her voice gaining strength. All of you. The board members exchanged glances, their confidence wavering slightly. There was something in Margaret's tone, a certainty that seemed at odds with her humble appearance. Your property ends at the surveyed line, Sandra said, checking her tablet. We're standing on Association Common Area. Margaret's smile was small but sharp. Are you sure about that? Of course we're sure, Todd snapped. I've reviewed the plat maps myself. The waterfront beyond the individual lots is designated common area, managed by the HOA for the benefit of all residents. Managed by the HOA, Margaret repeated thoughtfully. Interesting choice of words. Dr. Welsh frowned. Mrs. Chen, if you have some legal objection to the association's authority, you should have raised it through proper channels. The time for games is over. You're right, Margaret said, her voice carrying a note of finality that made the board members straighten unconsciously. The time for games is over. She turned toward her house, leaving the 4 board members standing by the water's edge. Their confident facade cracked slightly as they watched her retreat. Mrs. Chen, Vivian called out. We're not finished here. Margaret paused at her back door and looked over her shoulder. Yes, you are. You just don't know it yet. The door closed behind her with a soft click, leaving the board members in frustrated silence. Inside her kitchen, Margaret walked to the old wooden filing cabinet where she kept her most important documents. Her fingers traced the tabs until she found the one she needed. Property records, original purchase. She pulled out a manila folder, its edges worn from handling, and opened it on her kitchen table. Inside were documents that most people would consider routine paperwork: deed transfers, title insurance, survey maps. But Margaret had always been thorough, always been careful. When she and Robert had bought their property, she'd insisted on understanding every detail, every clause, every seemingly insignificant notation. Her finger traced the boundary description on the original deed, the same deed that had been gathering dust in her filing cabinet for 30 years, the same deed that the Willowbrook Estates developers had clearly never bothered to examine closely when they'd purchased the surrounding farmland. The same deed that, if she was reading it correctly, made their entire development's claim to the waterfront legally questionable. Margaret reached for her phone and dialed a number she'd memorized years ago but never called. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. Hartwell and Associates. This is David Hartwell. David, it's Margaret Chen. I think it's time we had that conversation about my property you mentioned at Robert's funeral. There was a long pause. Margaret, are you sure? Once we open this door, there's no going back. Through her kitchen window, Margaret could see the HOA board members still standing by the water, their heated discussion carrying across the morning air. Vivian was gesturing wildly, her face red with indignation. Todd was on his phone, probably calling reinforcements. Dr. Welsh was studying her boathouse with the calculating gaze of a man looking for weaknesses. I'm sure, Margaret said, her voice steady as bedrock. Bring everything you have. It's time these people learned that not everything in life can be bought. As she hung up the phone, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in years. The thrill of a fight she might actually win. The board members had made a critical error. They'd assumed that a modest house meant a modest understanding of the law. They'd assumed that gray hair meant surrender. They were about to learn that assumptions could be very, very expensive. Outside, Vivian Blackwood was already pulling out her own phone, her manicured fingers stabbing at the numbers with vicious precision. If Margaret Chen wanted to play hardball, she'd soon discover what real power looked like. The war for Willowbrook Estates was about to begin, and both sides were convinced they held the winning cards. 2 hours later, Margaret's quiet neighborhood resembled a battlefield. 3 Willowbrook Estates, security vehicles blocked her driveway, their amber lights flashing like warnings. Behind them, a county sheriff's patrol car sat ominously, its occupant speaking into his radio while eyeing the growing crowd of onlookers. Margaret watched from her kitchen window as more HOA board members arrived, each one dressed for conquest. Vivian had changed into a crisp business suit, transforming from suburban queen bee into corporate warrior. Todd Brennan stood beside a black Mercedes, pulling document boxes from the trunk with the efficiency of a general deploying artillery. The doorbell rang with the aggressive persistence of someone unaccustomed to waiting. Margaret smoothed her simple cardigan and opened the door to find Officer Martinez, a young deputy whose apologetic expression suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. "Ma'am, I'm sorry to bother you, but I've received a complaint about a structure on your property that allegedly violates county building codes." Behind him, Vivian stepped forward like a prosecutor, delivering an indictment. "Officer Martinez, as I explained, that boathouse is not only an HOA violation, but potentially a safety hazard. We have documentation showing it was built without proper permits." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "What documentation?" Todd appeared at Vivian's shoulder, briefcase in hand. "Mrs. Chen, we've done our research. County records show no building permits filed for any structure on this property between 1992 and 1994. That boathouse is illegal." Illegal. Margaret's voice carried a dangerous edge that made Officer Martinez shift uncomfortably. "Ma'am," the deputy said carefully, "if you could just show me any permits or documentation for the structure, ... Margaret stepped back into her house, leaving the door open. The assembled crowd could hear her moving through rooms, opening drawers, shuffling papers. When she returned, she carried a thick folder and wore an expression that made Vivian's confidence falter slightly. "Officer Martinez," Margaret said, her voice carrying the clarity of someone who had spent years as a legal secretary, "here are the building permits for my boathouse filed with the county in February 1993, approved in March and signed off by the building inspector in August of that year." She handed him a sheaf of official documents, their edges yellowed with age, but their seals and signatures still clear. The deputy studied them carefully, while the HOA board exchanged increasingly uncomfortable glances. "These appear to be in order," Officer Martinez said finally. "Ma'am, the structure seems to be legally permitted." Vivian's face went through several shades of red before settling on a dangerous purple. "That's impossible. Our legal team researched this thoroughly." "Perhaps your legal team should have researched more carefully," said a new voice from behind. The crowd, everyone turned to see a tall, distinguished man in his 60s approaching, carrying a leather satchel and wearing the quiet confidence of someone who'd won more battles than he'd lost. "David Hartwell," he said, extending his hand. "To Officer Martinez. I represent Mrs. Chen." Todd Brennan's eyes widened slightly. Everyone in the legal community knew Hartwell and Associates. They specialized in property law and had a reputation for taking on cases that other firms considered unwinnable. More importantly, they almost never lost. "David," Margaret said warmly, "thank you for coming so quickly." "Margaret, when you explained the situation, I knew we couldn't wait." Hartwell's gaze swept over the assembled HOA board with the cool assessment of a predator evaluating prey. "I see the vultures have gathered. Now see here," his earlier confidence evaporating. "We're simply enforcing legitimate community standards." Mrs. Chen signed a covenant agreement when she joined the association. Hartwell smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. "Did she? How interesting. I'd love to see that signature." The silence stretched uncomfortably as Todd realized he'd walked into a trap. Well, obviously, she didn't sign it personally. "The covenant runs with the land. It's automatic." "Automatic," Hartwell repeated, savoring the word like a fine wine. "Officer Martinez, since there's clearly no criminal matter here, perhaps you could help these people find their way off Mrs. Chen's property." "Now wait just a minute," Vivian snapped, her carefully constructed poise finally cracking. "We have every right to be here. This is association business." "Actually," Hartwell said, opening his satchel and pulling out a document, "you don't. This is a cease and desist order filed this morning with the county court, prohibiting any further harassment of Mrs. Chen or interference with her legal use of her property." Dr. Welsh stepped forward, his medical training making him the group's voice of reason. "Mr. Hartwell, surely we can resolve this amicably. The association isn't trying to harm Mrs. Chen. We're simply trying to maintain property values for everyone in the community." "Property values," Margaret said quietly, and something in her tone made everyone stop talking. "You want to talk about property values?" She walked to where Hartwell stood and took another document from his satchel. "Officer Martinez, would you mind reading the property description on this deed? Out loud, please?" The deputy took the document reluctantly, clearly wishing he was back on traffic duty. Beginning at the iron pin marker at the intersection of Willowbrook Drive and County Road 47. Thence north along the eastern boundary of the Harrison family farm to the natural waterline of Willowbrook Lake. Thence following said waterline, in a westerly direction for a distance of— He paused, his eyes widening as he continued reading. "For a distance of 2,400 feet, including all riparian rights and lake bed access." "Keep reading," Margaret said, her voice steady as granite. "Including all riparian rights and lake bed access to the center line of Willowbrook Lake. Thence south along said center line to the property marker established by County Survey, 1992 to 118. Thence east along." The deputy's voice trailed off as he realized what he was reading. Vivian snatched the document from his hands, her eyes scanning the legal description with growing horror. "This is impossible. The lake is common area. The development company purchased riparian rights from the county." "Did they?" Hartwell asked pleasantly. "How fascinating. I'd love to see those documents." Todd was already on his phone barking orders to someone about finding original deeds and survey maps. Sandra Fleming stood frozen, her tablet clutched. To her chest, like a shield, Dr. Welsh looked like a man watching a terminal diagnosis confirm itself. "You're telling me," Vivian said, her voice rising to a pitch that made several neighbors' dogs start barking, "that you own the entire lake?" "Not the entire lake," Margaret corrected. "Just the waterfront your development sits on. About 40% of the total lake area, including the marina, the boat launch, the swimming beach, and the water rights for the entire eastern shore." The crowd of onlookers had grown to include most of the neighborhood, drawn by the commotion. Margaret could see faces in the windows of the million-dollar homes surrounding her modest ranch house. Their owners probably wondering why police cars were parked outside the property they'd been trying to force into compliance. "This is fraud," Vivian whispered, her face pale beneath her makeup. "Someone would have caught this. The title company, the lawyers, the surveyors, ... "Someone did catch it," Hartwell said. "Robert Chen. He was a surveyor, you know. When he and Margaret bought this property, he insisted on a complete boundary survey. He noticed that the county records showed riparian rights that had never been properly transferred to any development company." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes at the mention of her late husband. Robert had been so careful, so thorough. He'd insisted they understand exactly what they were buying, down to the last square foot. At the time, she'd thought his obsession with property lines was excessive. Now she realized it was prescient. But the development company, Todd began. "Weekly made a very expensive mistake," Hartwell finished. "They purchased the farmland surrounding the lake, but they never bothered to verify the water rights. They assumed the county had clear title to transfer. The county assumed the original. Settlers' claims had been properly resolved. Everyone assumed, and no one checked." Officer Martinez cleared his throat. "Folks, I think this is a civil matter now. Mrs. Chen, do you want these people charged with trespassing?" Margaret looked at the faces surrounding her. Vivian's desperate fury, Todd's growing panic, Dr. Welsh's stunned disbelief, Sandra's calculating expression as she tried to figure out damage control. These people had spent months treating her like an obstacle to be removed, a problem to be solved, a relic to be swept aside. "Not today," she said finally, "but I want them off my property." Now, as the HOA board members retreated to their luxury, Vivian turned back one last time. "This isn't over, Margaret. We'll fight this in court. We'll prove those documents are fraudulent." Margaret smiled, and for the first time in years, it reached her eyes. "Please do. I'd love to see you explain to a judge why you've been collecting dock fees and marina revenues from property you don't own." The Mercedes engine roared to life with unnecessary aggression as Todd Brennan peeled away from the curb. The security, Vehicles followed, their amber lights now seeming more like retreat signals than warnings. As the crowd dispersed, David Hartwell remained behind. The emergency HOA board meeting convened at 8 o'clock that evening in the Willowbrook Estates clubhouse, a gleaming monument to suburban excess that had cost the association nearly $3 million to build. The room buzzed with angry voices as homeowners demanded answers, their usual cocktail party civility replaced by the raw panic of people watching their investments crumble. Vivian Blackwood stood at the front of the room, her earlier confidence replaced by the brittle composure of someone barely holding it together. Dark circles under her eyes betrayed the afternoon she'd spent making increasingly desperate phone calls to lawyers, title companies, and county officials. "Ladies and gentlemen, please," she said, her voice cutting through the chaos. "I know everyone is concerned about the situation with Mrs. Chen, but I assure you the board is handling it," shouted Marcus Steinberg from the third row, his face red with indignation. "My doc fees alone are $12,000 a year. Are you telling me I've been paying some old lady to use my own waterfront?" "We don't know that yet," Todd Brennan interjected, though his usual legal confidence had abandoned him. "The documents could be forgeries. We're having them authenticated by experts." "What experts?" demanded Patricia Holloway, the owner of a $7 million estate with 300 feet of premium lake frontage. "Because I just spent $47,000 on a new boat lift that apparently sits on her property." Dr. Welsh attempted to restore order. "Everyone, please. Getting emotional won't solve anything. We need to approach this systematically." Systematically. The voice came from the back of the room, where James Forster, retired CEO of a major construction company, stood with his arms crossed. "Harrison, the systematic approach would have been to verify the goddamn property rights before we built a $100 million development around a lake we don't own." The room erupted again, voices overlapping in a cacophony of fear and rage. Through the clubhouse windows, the lake sparkled in the evening light, its surface dotted with boats and jet skis, all operating from facilities that might legally belong to Margaret Chen. Sandra Fleming stood up, her tablet clutched in white hands. "I've been reviewing our financials. If Mrs. Chen's claims are valid, we could be liable for approximately $2.7 million in collected marina fees, plus damages. Plus what we've spent on waterfront improvements," added Dr. Welsh grimly. "The beach renovation, the new docks, the boat launch expansion. Another $1.2 million? That's $4 million, whispered Eleanor Ashford, the association's secretary. "Our entire reserve fund is only $2.8 million. The silence that followed was deafening. These were people accustomed to wielding power through wealth, to solving problems by throwing money at them. The realization that they might not have enough money to throw was paralyzing. "There has to be a way out of this," Vivian said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Some legal loophole? Some statute of limitations?" "Actually," said a new voice from the doorway, "there is." Everyone turned to see David Hartwell entering the clubhouse, his presence commanding immediate attention. Behind him, Margaret Chen followed quietly, her simple dress and cardigan, a stark contrast to the designer outfits surrounding her. "You're not welcome here," Vivian snapped, finding her voice. "This is a private meeting." "Actually," Hartwell replied smoothly, "since Mrs. Chen owns the waterfront property your clubhouse sits on, she has every right to be here. The original deed includes a 20-foot easement for lakefront access." Margaret stepped forward, and the room fell silent. Up close, away from the confrontational atmosphere of the morning, she looked smaller, more vulnerable, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "I didn't come here to gloat," she said. "I came to offer you a solution." Todd Brennan leaned forward suspiciously. "What kind of solution?" "I'm prepared to sell you the water rights," Margaret said simply. "All of them, for fair market value." The room erupted in murmurs of relief and calculation. Vivian's face showed the first genuine smile she'd worn all day. "What's fair market value?" James Forrester asked, his business instincts overriding his earlier anger. Margaret glanced at Hartwell, who opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick appraisal document. "Based on comparable waterfront sales in the area, current marina revenues, and the development potential of the property, we're looking at approximately $12 million. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Sandra Fleming's tablet clattering to the floor. $12 million. Vivian's voice was barely a whisper. That's impossible. The association doesn't have $12 million. I understand that, Margaret said gently, which is why I'm prepared to accept payment in installments. 5% down, the remainder financed over 15 years at current market rates. Hartwell smiled. That would be approximately $600,000 down, with monthly payments of roughly $78,000. $78,000 a month. Dr. Welsh looked like he was having a heart attack. Our current monthly assessments only bring in $45,000 total. Then you'll need to increase them, Margaret said matter-of-factly, or find another way to finance the purchase. Patricia Holloway stood up, her face flushed with indignation. This is extortion. You're trying to force us out of our homes. No, Margaret replied, her voice gaining strength. I'm offering you exactly what you offered me this morning, the chance to make improvements to increase property values. The difference is, my offer is legal. Mrs. Chen, Todd said, his lawyer instincts searching for an angle. Surely we can negotiate something more reasonable. The association has been maintaining that waterfront for 15 years. We've invested millions in improvements. That has to count for something. It does count, Hartwell agreed. It counts as a significant improvement to Mrs. Chen's property value, which is why the appraisal is so high. Marcus Steinberg was frantically calculating on his phone. Even if we pass the costs on to homeowners, we're talking about additional assessments of $1,500 per month per household for 15 years. $1,800, corrected Eleanor Ashford, who had been doing her own math. We'd need to account for defaults and collection costs. The room dissolved into chaos again as homeowners began calculating what the additional costs would mean for their budgets. Some could absorb the increase easily, but others, particularly those who'd stretched to afford their homes, looked stricken. There has to be another way, Vivian said desperately. We could contest the deed, claim adverse possession. Something. Hartwell's laugh was cold. Adverse possession requires 20 years of exclusive, continuous use. Your development is only 15 years old, and Mrs. Chen has been using the waterfront continuously since 1993. What about eminent domain? Suggested Dr. Welsh. The county could condemn the property for public use. The county has no interest in taking over private waterfront property, Hartwell replied. I checked. Besides, eminent domain requires fair compensation, which brings us back to $12 million. Margaret watched the faces around her, seeing the same expressions she'd worn countless times over the past 5 years. Frustration, helplessness, the crushing weight of forces beyond her control. Part of her felt sympathy for these people who were just discovering what it felt like to be powerless, but only part of her. I'll give you 30 days to decide, she said finally. The same 30 days you gave me to tear down my boathouse. And if we refuse? Vivian asked, though her voice suggested she already knew the answer. Then I'll exercise my full property rights, Margaret replied. I'll close the marina. I'll revoke all dock permits. I'll charge fair market rent for every boat lift, every dock, every square foot of waterfront access, and I'll sue for 15 years of back rent plus damages. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Without marina access, the waterfront homes would lose millions in value. Without boat access, half the amenities that justified the premium prices would disappear. The exclusive lakefront lifestyle that defined Willowbrook Estates would simply cease to exist. This is insane, whispered Patricia Holloway. One person can't hold an entire community hostage. One person didn't, Margaret said quietly. One community held one person hostage for 5 years, and now it's time to pay the price. As she and Hartwell walked toward the exit, Vivian called out one last time. Margaret, wait, please. Has to be some other arrangement we can make. Some compromise. Margaret paused at the door and looked back at the room full of frightened, angry faces. You had 5 years to compromise with me, Vivian. You chose to threaten me instead. You chose to try to force me out. You chose to treat me like a problem, to be solved rather than a neighbor, to be respected. Her voice grew stronger with each word. But mostly, you chose to underestimate me. That was your biggest mistake. The door closed behind them with a soft click, leaving the Willowbrook Estates HOA board to contemplate the ruins of their perfect world. Outside, Margaret breathed in the cool evening air and felt something she hadn't experienced in years. intoxicating taste of victory. But as she and Hartwell walked back toward her modest home, she knew the real war was just beginning. The HOA wouldn't give up easily and desperate people with money and connections. The campaign against Margaret Chen began at dawn the next morning with the sound of chainsaws. Margaret woke to the mechanical shriek of power tools and the crash of falling timber. She rushed to her kitchen window to see a crew of workers systematically destroying the mature oak trees that bordered her property line, trees that had provided shade and privacy for 30 years. "They're on their own property," David Hartwell said grimly when she called him. "Legally, they can cut down any trees they want." By noon, the eastern side of Margaret's lot was exposed to the harsh glare of sun and the intrusive gaze of her neighbors. The century-old oaks lay in massive heaps, their destruction as deliberate as it was devastating. But the trees were only the beginning. The first citation arrived via certified mail that afternoon. Violation of county noise ordinance, excessive boat motor activity. Margaret stared at the official document in bewilderment. Her small fishing boat hadn't been on the water in 3 days. The second citation came an hour later. Improper sewage disposal, residential property. The third accused her of violating water quality standards. The fourth claimed she was operating an illegal business from her home. "They're carpet bombing you with complaints," Hartwell explained during an emergency meeting in Margaret's living room. "File enough citations, and eventually something might stick. Even if it doesn't, the legal costs of fighting them add up. Can they do this? They can file complaints. Whether they hold up in court is another matter. But defending against frivolous lawsuits is expensive, even when you win." As if summoned by their conversation, Margaret's doorbell rang. Through the peephole, she saw a young woman in a business suit holding a clipboard. "Mrs. Chen, I'm Jennifer Walsh from the County Health Department. We've received reports of possible environmental violations on your property." Margaret felt her chest tighten. What kind of violations? The inspector consulted her clipboard with the bureaucratic efficiency of someone who'd done this many times before. Improper boat fuel storage, potential groundwater contamination, and unlicensed disposal of hazardous materials. "That's ridiculous. I don't store boat fuel on my property. I'm sure it's just a misunderstanding," Jennifer said with practiced sympathy. "If you could just let me take a look around, we can probably clear this up quickly." Margaret glanced at Hartwell, who nodded. Grimly, "Mrs. Chen is happy to cooperate, but I'll need to accompany you during the inspection." For the next 2 hours, Jennifer Walsh examined every inch of Margaret's property with microscopic attention. She tested the soil around the boathouse, photographed the small shed where Margaret kept her gardening tools, and took water samples from the lake near her dock. "Everything appears to be in order," she said finally, her tone suggesting disappointment. "I'll file my report by the end of the week." As soon as the inspector left, Margaret's phone began ringing. The caller ID showed Willowbrook Estates Security. "Mrs. Chen, this is Brad Morrison, head of community security. We've had several reports of trespassing on your property." "Trespassing? Yes, ma'am." "Residents have reported seeing unauthorized individuals on the waterfront area behind your home. For everyone's safety, we'll need to increase security patrols in that area." Margaret looked out her window to see a white security vehicle parked across the street, its occupant watching her house through binoculars. "The waterfront behind my home is my property, Mr. Morrison. Anyone I invite there is authorized to be there. Well, that may be a matter of interpretation. Ma'am, until the property dispute is resolved, we need to ensure community safety." The harassment campaign escalated throughout the week. Margaret's mailbox was vandalized twice. Her garbage cans were knocked over every night, their contents scattered across her lawn. Someone called the fire department 3 times, reporting gas leaks that didn't exist. But the psychological warfare reached its peak on Friday afternoon, when Margaret returned from the grocery store to find a for sale sign planted in her front yard. But the message was clear. They wanted her gone, and they weren't going to stop until she left. Margaret pulled the sign from her lawn with trembling hands, her anger finally overcoming her patience. She'd endured a week of petty cruelties, of death by 1,000 cuts, and she was done being the victim. Her phone call to Hartwell was brief and decisive. "David, I want to exercise my property rights. All of them. Starting tomorrow." "Margaret, are you sure? Once we take this step, there's no going back. They made sure of that when they cut down my trees." Saturday morning dawned gray and overcast, the kind of day that felt heavy with impending storms. Margaret stood on her dock at precisely 8 a.m., flanked by Hartwell and a team of county officials. In her hand, she held a stack of legal documents that would change everything. The first boat approached the marina at 8:15, a sleek yacht belonging to Marcus Steinberg. As it neared the dock, Margaret stepped forward. "I'm sorry, Mr. Steinberg, but you don't have permission to dock here." Steinberg cut the engine, his face flushing red. "What the hell are you talking about? I've been docking here for 10 years. "Not anymore," Margaret replied calmly. "This is private property, and you're trespassing." Behind her, County Marine Patrol Officer Sarah Kim stepped forward. "Sir, you'll need to move your vessel. This is now a restricted area." "This is insane," Steinberg shouted. "I pay $12,000 a year in dock fees." "You pay $12,000 to an organization that didn't own the docks," Hartwell explained. "Mrs. Chen is the legal owner of this waterfront, and she's revoking all unauthorized access." The scene was repeated throughout the morning as boat after boat was turned away from the marina. Some owners left quietly, their faces grim with understanding. Others argued, threatened, or pleaded, but the result was the same. By noon, the bustling marina was empty, except for Margaret's small fishing boat. The real drama began when the county arrived to post the official notices. Large signs went up at every access point. "Private property, no trespassing violators, will be prosecuted." Patricia Holloway arrived at 2 p.m., her face streaked with tears of rage. "You can't do this. My boat is worth $300,000. Where am I supposed to keep it? You're destroying our community. These homes are worthless without lake access." "Then perhaps you should have thought of that before you tried to destroy my home." As word spread through the neighborhood, more residents arrived. Dr. Welsh attempted to negotiate, offering to personally pay Margaret's asking price for his family's boat access. Eleanor Ashford broke down crying, explaining that her late husband's sailboat was all she had left of him. But it was Vivian Blackwood's arrival that brought the confrontation to its climax. She marched across the lawn like a general leading a final charge, her face set in lines of absolute determination. "Margaret, this has gone far enough. You've made your point. Name your price. What will it take to end this?" Margaret looked at the woman who had spent months treating her like a problem to be solved, a nuisance to be eliminated. "My price hasn't changed. Vivian, $12 million. The association will never agree to that. You're asking us to bankrupt ourselves." "No," Margaret said quietly. "I'm asking you to pay for what you took. You took my peace. You took my privacy. You took my dignity. You tried to take my home." Her voice grew stronger with each word. "You cut down trees that were older than your development. You filed false complaints. You harassed me, intimidated me, and tried to drive me away from the only home I've ever loved." Vivian's carefully maintained composure finally cracked. "Fine, you want to play hardball. Let's play hardball. I'll tie you up in court for years. I'll file appeals on every decision. I'll make your life hell until you give up." Margaret smiled, and it was the most dangerous expression anyone had ever seen on her gentle face. "You already tried that, Vivian. How did it work out for you?" As the sun set over Willowbrook Lake, the exclusive marina stood empty for the first time in 15 years. The multi-million-dollar boats that defined the community's status sat stranded in distant marinas, their owners facing a choice between financial ruin and complete surrender. In her kitchen, Margaret made herself a cup of tea and watched the news crews setting up their equipment on the public road. The story had leaked, and by tomorrow morning, the Battle of Willowbrook Estates would be headline news across the region. She thought about Robert, about the careful way he'd measured every board of their boathouse, the pride in his eyes when they'd launched their first boat from the dock he'd built with his own hands. He'd protected her then, in his quiet, methodical way. Now it was her turn to protect what they'd built together. The phone rang, and Margaret saw Hartwell's number on the display. "Margaret, I just got a call from Todd Brennan. The HOA wants to meet tomorrow morning. They're ready to negotiate." Margaret sipped her tea and watched the lights of the empty marina reflect on the dark water. "Tell them I'll be there." "But David," "Yes, tell them to bring a checkbook. This ends tomorrow, one way or another."